Welcome to my economics channel, where I love discussing the topic, but most importantly, I love to make it something fun and interesting to learn. And actually, in today's episode, I want to look at when and how money matters for growth in any economy, and in particular throughout history. When and how has money mattered for the growth that we have seen, and indeed for the growth that we continue to see as time goes on. So of course, we all use money on a day-to-day basis and we interact with money and we're intimately familiar with it. But are there areas of the economy or are there parts in history where money hasn't mattered quite as much? Or has money forever and always been intrinsically tied to growth in the economy? So let's start off with a simple definition. What is money? So of course, there are many examples out there, and there's of course a dictionary definition. However, I think it's most useful to have the following definition in mind when thinking about money. And that is that money is a psychologically accepted means of payment for goods and services to transfer between a group of people. And the reason this is important is that because there's been thousands of forms of money throughout history. And indeed, right now, the vast majority of our money in the modern world is simply ones and zeros on hard drives in really big servers. If you think to the money in your bank, of course, that is not held as physical cash. That is simply as a ledger entry in the bank, which ultimately is comprised of ones and zeros. So money is a unit of account, it has some sort of value to it, and it's used as a medium of exchange. But there's no money that's really better than any other money. It's simply what is most useful at the time. And this is why there's been so many forms of money and why there will continue to be many forms of money going into the future. Now, of course, one question we can ask is Bitcoin money? And the answer to that is no. It's not widely used enough, it's not accepted enough. Can it become money into the future? Well, who knows? But for now, it's simply small fry compared to the amount that fiat money commands in the economy, compared to the amount of transactions which are done in fiat money. So that's the definition of money out of the way, but what does this matter for growth? So think to any of the classic empires, the Persian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, maybe Charlemagne's Empire, the Golden Horde, and the Mongolian Empire. In fact, the last one was the largest contiguous empire on Earth. But let's hone in on one example. Let's think to Mount Potosi and the tens of thousands of tons of silver flowing into Spain from there every single year for many decades. This was money flowing straight into Spain, and yet, how much did it actually help Spain? This, as we can see, is Spanish GDP per capita over this period. Spain did not become the wealthiest nation or even increase its GDP much at all. But this is Spain on its own. How well did Spain do compared to other nations that did not have their own Mount Potosi? Not very well, as we can see. And so the average worker, and indeed the average person, did not benefit much from the flow of silver coming into Spain during this period. And in fact, as we can see, during this period, the Spanish crown defaulted on its debt many times. From 1557 to 1647 alone, the crown defaulted 6 times. But let's take the Mongols. They extracted concessions from the Ottoman Empire on a number of occasions as part of peace terms, and they did this to other nations as well. Of course, the Huns did a similar thing from the Roman Empire many centuries earlier. If we look at the micro level, and certainly the upper echelons of the Hun or the Mongol society, they benefited from these gold imports. They benefited from this flow of gold that went from either the Roman Empire or the Ottoman Empire into either the Mongol Empire or the Hunnic Empire. And so this is a transfer of wealth. And so for the people lucky enough to receive this flow of money, they were either status symbols or they were extra purchasing power. And so of course those people then saw economic growth. But of course if we zoom out and we look at a macro level, all we're seeing is a transfer of money or transfer of wealth from one empire into another. We don't get growth in the macro level. This transfer of money doesn't help both empires out. And so that is one sense in which the movement of money does not create wealth in the aggregate. It does not create wealth for everyone. Even if we just take the elites in both empires that are involved, one group of elites lose and the other group of elites gains. And so clearly in these specific instances, the movement of money is a wash, economically speaking. And of course, as was the case in ancient and medieval warfare, these flows of money could be reversed. But that of course doesn't mean that suddenly this other empire is now richer. Remember, it lost its money before, and all it's doing now is simply getting that money back. However, that doesn't cause economic growth in the aggregate. But even outside war payments or reparations, empires in general saw very little growth. The lives of most people did not change all that much over the course of any empire's existence. The only exception may be the Roman Empire, where Petar, the author of The Roman Market Economy, calculated that the empire grew by roughly 2% from about 0 AD to about 100 AD. And that's per capita growth. So people at let's say 70 AD were materially richer than people at, let's say, 10 AD. And that accounts for the fact that the population was larger at 70 AD. But it should be noted that this is 2% growth over the entire century, whereas we expect that growth to happen every year in most modern economies. So the movement of money between empires did very little for growth, and indeed it did very little for the people who were living inside these empires. There simply was not much growth overall, even as there were many transfers and much movement of money between different empires. And so clearly money mattered, otherwise why else draw concessions from the defeated? But it did not cause aggregate growth. It did not cause sustained growth in any particular empire. In fact, if we go back to the example of Mount Potosi and Spain, and the vastly increased silver imports into Spain, and of course the rest of Europe, we can see that all it did was create inflation. We did not increase GDP by all that much. So the question then is, why bring all of this up? Why does it matter? So the Industrial Revolution began in England. However you define it, whatever parameters you use, whatever dates you pick, it very clearly began in England. The process of increased productivity, sustained economic growth, and using power beyond that of our own muscles and indeed animals, all of that took off in England. Only China, many centuries earlier, could come close to starting its own industrial revolution. However, for many complicated factors, it did not take off there. However, when England was going through the Industrial Revolution, England was not the largest country, it was not the wealthiest country. It did not have massive amounts of money flowing into England, certainly nothing like Mount Potosi, and it only got the largest empire ever after the Industrial Revolution had already run its course. And from the book The Enlightened Economy by Joel Mokyr, I'm not sure how to say his name, I apologize for that. From that book, we understand that the Industrial Revolution was actually quite cheap. The first inventions were not expensive monetarily speaking. They just required the know-how, they required the institutions, they required the right incentives to come about. It was low-hanging fruit, if you will. And so essentially what that is saying is that any country, regardless of the flows of money into that country, if it had the right setup, it could have started its own industrial revolution and continued that process going forward. And so of course it helped that England sat on large reserves of coal. However, at the time, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, coal was not actually cheap. Cheap coal only came about as a process of the Industrial Revolution. It was technologies that came about that helped make coal cheaper. It was not the other way around. And in fact, the first mechanical machines, the Newcomen engines, they pumped water out of mines and they made it easier and safer to dig further into the earth and extract more coal. However, these were comically inefficient and could only be used right next to the mine itself. Because it was so inefficient and so expensive, it was simply not worth transporting the coal any further. Otherwise, you simply didn't get your money's worth. And in fact, from the Enlightened Economy on page 125, we have, as late as 1770, the wasteful Newcomen machines were almost exclusively used for pumping water out of coal mines in places where coal was very cheap. From the same book on page 269 we get, moreover, whereas coal was cheap in Britain near coal mines and later near canals connected to them, this was not a national parameter. Coal was considerably more expensive in areas remote from coal mines such as Cornwall. And adding to what I was saying before, on page 70 he concludes, the lower price of coal, rather than being a cause of the Industrial Revolution, was very much a consequence of it. So neither money nor cheap resources were strictly required to help bring about tremendous structural changes and shifts in society and start the process of tremendous per capita growth. These were necessary but not sufficient. England did not require its own Mount Potosi, and apparently it did not need it. So what does all of this come down to? What can we conclude about money given the facts above? So money matters to us, and it defines how we interact with one another and the resources that we have at our disposal. What if there's a credit crunch? That will then mean that people who previously had been doing fine and who had been able to feed, clothe, and house themselves are no longer able to do so. What if there's too much money in the economy? Then in that circumstance we get inflation and we only see prices rise and nothing else meaningfully changes in the economy. or certainly nothing else for the better. But in this instance, rapid price rises make it difficult to plan for the future, meaning you have to spend more time today worrying about your access to resources, time that you would have better spent at other areas in the economy, and your time would have been more efficiently used. And so this is why I think it's very useful to think of money as the way I described it at the start of the video, as a psychologically accepted means of exchange between individuals. Because as we've seen, it can take whatever form we need it to take given the current conditions. And whatever form money takes, whatever form is psychologically accepted to us, having too little is bad, and also having too much is also very bad. And so the form and the amount of money we need will depend upon the circumstances of the times. And so different times, different endowments of resources, different access to technology, all require different amounts of money, whatever form that takes, to be in circulation for us to efficiently and effectively use those resources that we have at our disposal. And indeed, going into the future to try and get more out of either the same amount of resources or even using less resources. But all of that depends upon the right amount of money being in circulation. But of course, it's not the money that we care about. It's ultimately the resources are what we care about. And this is why money has taken so many different forms in the past, and why it will most likely take many different forms going into the future. You can think about something I like to call the Mars test. If you were stranded on Mars, Matt Damon style, what would you want? $1 trillion, whatever form that takes, or would you want resources to then be able to survive on Mars? Clearly, unless you can spend that money, that $1 trillion does nothing for you. Whereas those resources, if you're skilled enough, you can do something with them. And this goes back to the example of the Industrial Revolution and how it was in fact actually quite cheap. What mattered were the resources. People became more productive, we could produce more things, and we could produce them cheaper, and by doing that, we could enrich more people. But it didn't actually need a large endowment of money in the first place. And then what happened, as the money supply grew and there was more things to buy, that money supply could buy more things. And this is what I mean by the right amount of money. We don't have too much money and we don't have too little. If we had too little money, all of those extra goods and services wouldn't mean much because then you couldn't buy them. But if we had too much money, all those extra goods and services would simply cost too much for many people. And so England, taking its banking system and combined with a central bank, produced the right amount of money that the Industrial Revolution needed. And this is one thing which helped perpetuate the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't something that simply petered out of existence. And so what I hope I've shown is that it's not entirely easy to answer where and when exactly money matters. Because it matters what form it takes, it matters what times we're in, and it also matters how much money there is. However, as we've seen in the case of Britain, the Industrial Revolution was actually quite cheap. What it actually needed was a bunch of factors coming together, which then allowed people to become more inventive, more productive, and so on. And for the first time, this helped produce sustained economic growth. And of course, going back to the example of Mars, if you were stranded on Mars, you wouldn't care about $1 trillion. You wouldn't care about $100 trillion. You'd care about the resources that you have at your disposal, which would then allow you to survive on Mars. And so naturally you would say, oh, with $1 trillion, I could buy things. But what if you're the only person on Mars? How then are you going to purchase something? And so this is one sense in which money matters with how we interact with one another and how we conduct ourselves, but it's not the entire story. But to finish up this video with, it is actually worth looking in detail at a bunch of graphs which show the growth of money in England during this time. And so as we would expect, given what I said before, during the Industrial Revolution, there was a growth in the money supply in England. However, we can see that this actually began earlier. And in fact, between 1550 and 1790, the supply of coins, which is a small component of the overall money supply, drastically exploded, whereas inflation, which we can think of as the price level, was actually quite muted. Clearly, there is more to the economy than the money supply and how this interacts with inflation. And so from these sources, I didn't get an explanation for why there was no accompanying inflation like there was in Spain, but perhaps the growth in productivity in England actually began in the mid-16th century, around the 1550s. And so the growth in the money supply was partially absorbed by the fact that there was simply more things to purchase. And so even though we generally say the Industrial Revolution began around the 1750s, it is possible and indeed quite likely that production started to rise in England on a per capita basis much before then. However, it was at a much slower pace, and then once the Industrial Revolution kicked in, it was then something that continued, rather than the Industrial Revolution being something that suddenly takes off. It's more likely that the Industrial Revolution was simply accelerating change that was already happening. And in fact, from this chart that we can see that runs from the 1530s to 1796, we can see that the growth in real incomes, that means over and above inflation, was actually matched pretty well by the coin supply. And in fact, after the 1740s, they match each other almost perfectly. And so this means that England has found the right amount of money that was required for the economy. There was not too little and there was not too much. But even looking at other parts of the graph, we can see that when one goes up, generally the other also goes up. Now this could be read one of two ways. Either economic growth, real economic growth in incomes, either required more money to be in circulation, or it was the fact that there was more money in circulation and therefore we got more economic growth, real economic growth. The graph does not say which way the correlation runs, and in fact the source that I got this from did not say either. And so that's all I wanted to say on that topic. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask below and I'll do my best to answer. Or what I'll do is I'll collect the questions and put it into another video that I'll make in the future and I'll answer it in more detail there. And I'll leave you with the classic: subscribe, rate and share, and hit that bell notification because that helps me tremendously. It helps my channel grow, and I'll see you guys next time.